Often in programming, we're going to want to reuse code that we've already written. And in order to do this, we're going to utilize functions for that purpose. Functions offer us a lot of benefits. The first is that it allows us to organize code into like sections so that we can understand a function does a particular purpose, say adds two numbers together. We know where to find that logic every time. It will be within a function, so it's sort of like self-contained. It will also allow us to repeat code in multiple different locations without having to rewrite the code. And the primary advantage of this is that if that code ever needs to change, we only ever have to change it in one spot, which is inside of the function, rather than changing it in multiple locations, which is very prone to error. So I'm going to demonstrate a few examples to show you how functions work to give you a general idea of this sort of concept. So for the first one, we'll do something relatively simple. Let's say that we want to ask a user for two numbers, and we want to add those two numbers together. And we might want to do this sort of multiple times throughout our program. So for instance, we could say num1 equals, let's say, we'll say that they're integer values, just to keep things simple. We'll say enter the first number. And then we'll say num2 equals int input enter the second number, right? So this would be an example, and then we could say like answer equals num1 plus num2, and then we could say print out the answer. So this would be a very simple program, right? The person inputs two numbers, the answer will add the two numbers together, and then we print out the answer. Now, what we're going to say is, suppose that we want them to then enter in like a third number, right? So maybe there'll be like a third number that they can input, enter the third number, right? And then maybe we want to take the answer, and we want to take the answer plus num3, right? So we could have done like answer plus equals num3 as well. Both would be the same. But essentially the idea is they input the two numbers, we add them together, and then they input a third number, and then we add that onto the total, right? So suppose that we wanted to implement this logic. The way that it's set up right now, you'll notice that there's a few different similarities, right? You'll notice that these adding two numbers together is something that's consistent. We're consistently adding two numbers together. So it could be a good candidate to turn that adding two numbers together into a function. So let's go ahead and do that. To do that, I'm going to head to the top of my program, and I'm going to type in the following. I'm going to type in def, and I'm going to type in the name of the function. Def simply just means like define. It tells it that we're defining a function. So my function is going to be called, let's say, add two numbers. So that's the name of our function, and then we're going to put a set of brackets. Inside of these brackets, we're going to say what values need to be provided to this function. So I'm going to say first and second, that being the first number that you want to add and the second number that you want to add. Then from here, what we could do is we could do something like this. We could say answer equals first plus second, and then we can do this, return answer. What happens here is when this function is called, we provide it with the first number and the second number that we want to add together. What will happen is it will add the two numbers together and set them equal to the answer. And then it will return back the answer that it calculated. So it will give back this answer to whatever was calling it. So to give you an idea of what exactly this is, if we can replace this num1 plus num2 with the following, add two numbers, first, or in this case it would be num1 and num2, right? So num1 and num2 are the two numbers that we want to add together. What will happen is the user inputs number 1 and they input number 2 as well. We then call this function, giving it the two numbers that were inputted. When we call that function, it comes up here and it goes ahead and calculates answer, which is equal to the first thing that was provided, which is num1, plus the second thing that was provided, which is num2. And then it returns the answer. So it returns first plus second. What that means is that when we come back here, this value returns back the answer, which was first plus second. So this answer is equal to what this function returns, which in this case is the first plus the second. So you can see that this allows us to add the two numbers together. And then from here, rather than doing answer plus num3, we can simply do add two numbers, answer num3, right? And again, it will call this function, providing it with the answer and num3, right? It will add those two together. Then it returns back answer, which means that this answer here is set equal to the sum of the two numbers. So this is the equivalent logic. Now, the reason why this is nice is because suppose we then change our mind and say, well, maybe I want to like add these two numbers and then add 2. So like do it plus 2, right? In the old way that we had this set up, we would have to add 2 here, and we would have to add 2 here as well. So we'd have to remember to change the code in 2 locations instead of just the 1. Thanks to functions, we can just change it in the single location and then not have to worry about changing it anywhere else. So it makes our programming more convenient and it makes it less error prone because we're able to just change it in one location. Also, it's a little bit more organized. If there was a lot more logic involved here, essentially every single time that we call this function, we would be able to cut down on lines of code. If the function is like 30 lines of code, that saves us 30 lines of code every single time we wanted to use what that function was providing to us. So that's sort of the value of functions. So this is the general idea of it. Now, I want to provide you with a few more examples of functions so that you can sort of get a bit more of an understanding. The first thing that I want to talk about here is that we don't always have to return something from a function. So let's change up the scenario a little bit. Let's suppose that we wanted to like add two numbers together like before. So we'll say num1 equals the int of input of enter a number, right? And then we could say num2 equals int of input of enter a number as well. So we have our two numbers that are inputted. And then let's suppose that we wanted to create a function that would just print out the numbers that were provided to us, right? So we just want to print out the two numbers that were provided. If I want to do this, I would create a function. So I would say def, let's call it print numbers. And in this case, we would provide it with the first number. I'll just call them first and second, just to keep things consistent with how we were doing it before, right? And then I just want to print out the values of the first and second. So I want to do something like print first and print second. I'll just do them in two separate print statements. We could also do them in like combined print statements, but then we'd have to, convert them into strings. It's a little bit easier just to print them on separate lines here. So we'll just leave it like that for now. And as you can see, this function doesn't return anything. So if we were to call, if we call print numbers with num1 and num2, right? When I run this, you'll see what happens is it will ask me for a number and then another number, and you see it just prints the two numbers out. Essentially, all that happens here is we call this function, it comes up here, it does the actions that are indented, and then it returns back to this point, but it doesn't return anything to it. It just brings us back to that point. So that's the general idea of when we don't have a return statement. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. You don't always have to return something from your function. Your function can just take an action and then bring you back to where it was called from. It doesn't necessarily have to return anything. Along a similar line, you don't always have to provide arguments to the function either. So you can sort of like remove these arguments and just have, an empty set of parentheses, which means that the function is called without any sort of argument to it. Now, there are a few different reasons why you may want to do this. You could have logic that isn't like dependent on any sort of variables from the program. It just sort of like does something like consistently each time. For example, take a look at these prompts here that say enter a number. This could be a perfect candidate for a function, right? Rather than having this, we could do something a little bit different. Let me demonstrate this. So suppose that we wanted to, print out two numbers. We could create a function called generate prompt, okay? And what this will do is it will return, please enter a number. So you can see that this one doesn't take in any arguments. It just simply returns back that text that's provided. Now, if we want to generate the numbers, we can say num1 equals int input generate prompt. What will happen here is we call the generate prompt function, which returns back please enter a number. So this becomes int input please enter a number. So the nice part about this is that now we don't have to worry about like consistently, writing out the prompt every single time. It takes a lot longer to write out the prompt than it does to write out the function name. In addition, if I wanted to change this to, say something different, like please enter a string, for instance, I only have to change it in one place rather than changing it in two places, right? So again, the general idea of functions is that they help us avoid that code reuse problem where if we want to reuse code, we're going to have to change it in multiple places if we aren't using functions. So this could be another good example of doing this. So just to show you this, when I do this, you see it says please enter a string. So it's sort of like the exact same idea, right? In this case, of course, entering a string doesn't work because I'm converting it to int, but you get the general idea. So, you can change it to please enter a number, and it will allow you to prompt a number in that case, right? So this is the idea of that. If you provide it with arguments, of course, you could do something like generate a prompt, 1 to be the first one, and then say like enter the first number, and then second for the second one for enter a second number, right? You could do something like that. These are often used for things like writing to log files where you're always opening the same file and then writing to it. You're just changing the message. All those sort of repetitive code reuse sort of situations is where functions really shine. So this should give you the general idea of functions, and you should understand the different types of functions now and the different things that you're able to do with them.